Welcome to session 4 of A Life Worth Living. In our last session, we explored how Jesus gives us a new attitude. In this session, we'll continue to read through Philippians chapter 2 and explore how Jesus gives us new responsibilities.
Before we continue, you might like to pause the video here. One person in your group can begin with a prayer, then the other person can read today's Bible passage, which is Philippians chapter 2, verse 12 to 18.
In Philippians 2, we see Paul urge the Christians to take responsibility for their lives and to take a responsible attitude to the society around them, making it quite clear that he takes his own responsibilities very seriously.
In today's society, many people are often unwilling to take responsibility for their actions. There is an increasing tendency to try and shift responsibility, blaming the government, the economy, the environment, employers, doctors, parents, or our partner. This refusal to take responsibility goes right back to the time when Adam sinned. Adam refused to take responsibility for his actions. He blamed his wife. Eve refused to take responsibility for her actions. She blamed the devil. But ultimately, whatever the mitigating circumstances, we are all accountable for our actions and our lives.
What does this responsibility look like in practice? Firstly, every Christian must take responsibility for their life. Paul urges the Christians at Philippi, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but also in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose." Paul links this section to the previous by the word therefore. It's because Jesus has set an example of obedience in working out his responsibility that we are able to follow that example and to work out our salvation. In fact, that is the only appropriate response to Jesus' sacrifice on our behalf.
Salvation is perhaps the most important word in the New Testament. If you find salvation sounds like a bit of a meaningless religious jargon, freedom is an excellent substitute. To be saved by Jesus Christ is to be set free. Jesus sets us free from our guilt, our addictions, our fear of death, and with that comes freedom from all other fears. He sets us free to know God, to love others, and to be our true selves as God made us to be.
Freedom and responsibility go hand in hand. Bob Dylan puts it like this: "I think of a hero as someone who understands the degree of responsibility that comes with his freedom."
We all have free will and are therefore responsible for our actions. Christians enjoy an even greater freedom. Romans 8 verse 21 speaks of the glorious freedom of the children of God. With greater freedom comes greater responsibility.
Paul tells us that we are to work out our freedom. This is quite different from working for our freedom. It is not an objective yet to be reached or a benefit to be merited, but rather it is a possession to be explored and enjoyed more fully. In particular, we need to work out the path along which we are to walk in response to God's call. We need to work out how God has created each of us to serve. Each person has a different calling. For some, it will be along the lines of ministry with the poor. For others, it will be evangelism. For others, healing. For others, a prophetic ministry or teaching or some other area. It is our responsibility to discover our gifts and to use them.
I once read the obituary of George Hoffman, who founded Tear Fund, and as its director guided its fortunes for the first 21 years. He saw its first year's income of £34,000 grow to 15 million before he moved on. He captured the ideals of a whole generation whose eyes were opened to the dimension of tragedy on a global scale involving famine, flood, earthquake, and a massive refugee problem. The obituary said, "His face could move from pain and horror to humor in a few seconds. His voice could be strong, gentle, full of passionate intensity, and yet the underlying Merseyside wit was never absent. It was a recipe that caught the attention of thousands of Christian people and turned their minds to the alleviating of human need across the world. Here was a man who took his responsibility seriously and worked out his freedom for God's glory. Paul says we are to work out our freedom with reverence and sensitivity. Let's not take this lightly, and let's make the most of our lives.
After working as a school teacher for a number of years, the assumption was that I would have applied for a promotion to be head of department, head of year, head of curriculum, head of something. The truth was that I didn't want to be head of anything because I knew that with each promotion, I would be in the classroom less and less with the students. I knew that God had called me to be a classroom teacher, and that was where my gifts were used fully. I knew that it came across as though I had very little ambition, but in fact, my ambition just looked different to those around me. My ambitions were centered around being in the classroom with the students. I knew that if I followed the career path that others expected from me, it would be me wasting what I felt God had called me to. I had worked out that God had created me to teach, and it was as a teacher that I could be of greatest service.
Some of us might feel God has created us to work in and for the church. But for most of us, our newfound freedom will be worked out in the office, in business, in the warehouse, in the hospital, school, or home. Each of us has a responsibility before God to work out what He is calling us to do, and then to do it for His glory.
There is a very careful balance in Paul's wording of this sentence. We are to work out our salvation because it is God who works in us. Our newfound freedom is a gift from God, and even in the working out of it, we need His help. No sin can be conquered, nor anything of lasting worth be accomplished without His help. We have to cooperate with the Spirit of God in all that we do. God's work in us includes our will. He works in us to will and to act according to His good purpose. Many fear to trust God with their futures because they fear that He will make them do something which they have no desire to do, or that He will make a mess of their lives.
Both of these fears are, of course, without foundation. If our will is surrendered to His will, God will give us the desire to do whatever He is calling us to do. If He is calling us to a ministry with the poor, that is where our heart will be. Or if He is calling us to teach, He will give us a desire to teach. For a long time, I felt a call to church ministry. I was working as a doctor at the time and felt very happy in that career, but I still had an underlying sense that I was called to something else. As I made steps towards this call, it wasn't so much that I stopped enjoying working in medicine. It was more like my desire to work in church ministry was greater. As I surrendered to God's will for me, He gave me the desire to do the very thing He was calling me to do.
If we surrender to His will, He will work out His good purpose in us and through us. What He wants for our lives is good. It doesn't mean that it will be easy, but we won't be able to improve on His plan. In fact, working out our salvation means fulfilling our potential.
Let's pause here for discussion in our groups and consider the following questions. What do you think is the difference between working out freedom and working for freedom? Are there any areas in your life where you need God's help to enjoy and explore more fully His freedom? And in what ways do you think God is calling you to serve? What would it look like for you to take responsibility for this?
So we've looked at how we take responsibility for our own life. Secondly, Paul addresses our responsibility to society. The New Testament speaks not so much of society's responsibility for us, but of our responsibility for those around us. Paul speaks of a crooked and depraved generation. The word crooked suggests that it is warped in its activities, and the word depraved suggests that it is distorted in its values. This is true not just of Paul's generation, but of ours and of every other generation.
We are living in a society that has increasingly shut God out. One article in the Guardian newspaper reflected, In societies where religious belief is dwindling and trust in the establishment is under threat, the idea of looking somewhere else for guidance has made a kind of sense.
Christians are called to live lives that are noticeably different from those around them. We are called to do everything without complaining or arguing. The original Greek word for arguing refers to an intellectual rebellion against God. The word for complaining refers more to a moral rebellion against God. The best English translation would be murmuring, which also conjures up the sound made by those who are grumbling. It is the word used in Exodus 15 and 16 of the people of Israel. The people of Israel had received great blessings, and yet a few days later, they were grumbling. We could say that they had an attitude that says, "Poor me," and "It's not fair," an attitude of self-pity.
Both attitudes, complaining and arguing, are the opposite of praise. We read in Hebrews 13 verse 15 that this praise is called the fruit of lips, words that confess the name of Jesus. Praise of God and encouraging others rather than complaining and arguing should characterize the lives of Christians so that we may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault. The Message translation puts it like this: do everything readily and cheerfully. No bickering, no second guessing allowed. Go out into the world uncorrupted, a breath of fresh air in this squalid and polluted society. Provide people with a glimpse of good living and of the living God. Carry the light-giving message into the night.
As we live like this, it's likely we will be in sharp contrast to the world around us. We will shine like stars in the universe. Our lifestyle should be a shining example to the world around. But our responsibility involves not just our lifestyle, but also our lips. We have a responsibility to hold out the word of life, to speak about Jesus and proclaim the gospel to a society desperately needing God.
Matthew Paris, the Times columnist, wrote this: does the God of the New Testament exist? Please accept that I am not here trying to persuade you that he does or does not, but to communicate my surprise that the question is so little asked. I simply cannot understand why all those millions of my countrymen who mumble that they are probably believers can regard their uncertainty as less than a personal emergency. Why are they not driven to find out more? The New Testament offers a picture, a God who does not sound at all vague to me. He sent his Son to earth. He has distinct plans both for his Son and for mankind. He knows each of us personally and can communicate directly with us. We are capable of forming a direct relationship with him. We are told that this can be done only through his Son. And we are offered the prospect of eternal life, an afterlife in happy, blissful, glorious circumstances. Friends, if I believed that, or even a tenth of that, how could I care which version of the prayer book was being used? I would drop my job, sell my house, throw away my possessions, leave my acquaintances, and set out into the world, burning with the desire to know more, and when I had found out more, to act upon it and tell others.
Once we have truly discovered Christ, surely we would want to hold out the word of life by both our actions and our lips. We are surrounded by those who are dissatisfied because they have never found relationship with God for which they were made. The good news of Jesus Christ not only tells of life, it also imparts life to those who hear and respond in faith. It's therefore both our responsibility and our privilege to hold out this message to the society around us.
So we've looked at how we take responsibility for our own life and our responsibility for society. Paul also shows us our responsibility to the church.
Paul's care and concern for the Christians at Philippi are an example to us of how we should view our responsibilities towards the church. He uses two illustrations. First, he uses an illustration from the world of athletics. He says he wants to be able to boast of the day of Christ, that he did not run or labor for nothing. The word he uses for labor is probably a continuation of the same metaphor as running and refers to the training for the athletic games. In the Greek world, there were the athletic events of Corinth and Ephesus, as well as the Olympic Games. The The training for these games involved a rigorous regime. Paul saw his efforts on behalf of the Philippians in these terms. He needed to be in peak condition spiritually. He needed to run and to labor on their behalf, as he does not want his efforts to be wasted. It can be extremely disappointed to nurture new Christians and see that effort come to nothing if they fall away. But equally, there is great joy in seeing the fruit of our efforts in those who do grow in their love and service for Jesus.
The second image that Paul uses is even stronger. It is one of sacrifice. He speaks of being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith. The drink offering was the cup of wine poured out as a sacrifice to the local gods, accompanying a larger sacrifice. It was therefore a small thing which brought the major sacrifice to completion. Paul regarded the faith and service of the Philippians as a sacrifice offered to God. The language he uses suggests they are like priests. In the New Testament, every believer is a priest. The priesthood is no longer confined to a select group or tribe. All the Christians at Philippi are priests. Their faith and their good deeds, which spring out of their faith, are the sacrifice. Paul's love and sense of responsibility for them shows that he is willing to pour out his life before God for their sake, even if that means his own death. In fact, he says he would be glad and rejoice if that were ever the case, and so should they. Ministry, therefore, is pouring out ourselves for others.
In Libby Perv's book, Holy Smoke, she devotes a chapter to her encounters with various Christians. She writes, "Even more unforgettable was Jackie Pullinger, a radical young Christian musician who set off across the world with a chaotic naivety to find where she was called to work. She lighted upon Hong Kong's walled city of Kowloon, the city of darkness, before that unspeakable slum was pulled down in 1989. In this place of misery, of violence, of prostitutes from 10 to 70 years old, of almost universal drug addiction and triad gangs, she walked the dark alleys, seeing another city in its place, ablaze with light. It was my dream. No more crying, no more death or pain."
Jackie's heart went out to the people she met. She simply prayed for them, that they would be set free from drug addiction or from forced prostitution. Gradually, she established houses for the addicts and prostitutes, and thousands have left those houses with their lives transformed by the light of Christ. Our responsibility as Christians is to pour out our lives for others.
Let's break into our groups now and reflect on the following questions together. How does being a Christian change your everyday life? How do you hold out the word of life or proclaim the gospel in your everyday life? If ministry is pouring out ourselves for others, how are you already in ministry, and how could you grow in this?
Thanks so much for joining us for this session of A Life Worth Living, as we explored how Jesus gives us new responsibilities. In our next session, we'll continue reading through Philippians chapter 2 together. Take some time now to close this session in prayer.